So this is my autobiography entry number 4, and I'm going to be talking about prompt C, list the languages you know, how, when, and why did you learn them, what do they mean to you, and have they always meant the same to you, and explain. So I kind of categorized the languages that I know. So my primary language that I am dominant in and that I am fluent in is English. I use it on a daily basis. I learned it as an infant through talking to my parents and through talking to everyone in my life. I have always been around English speakers. Everyone in my family speaks English as their primary language. All of the schools I've gone to have been primarily English speaking, except for one, and I'll talk about that later. But that was just the language that I was born into, and that made the most sense for me. And it means the most to me out of any of the languages I have learned because it is my dominant language. And I think through taking this class and taking other language classes, I have grown a really big appreciation for language as a whole. But something that one of my professors said to me earlier in one of my sign language classes was that the language that if you want to get to know someone on a deeper level, you should communicate with them in their primary language. And I was kind of thinking about that and how if someone wanted to get to know me the best, speaking to me in English would be my most comfortable language, and is when I would probably open up a lot more, rather than in a secondary language like sign language or Spanish, where I would be questioning if I was using the language right, if I was being understood, if I was understanding them. And so my appreciation for English as my primary language has grown a lot, and I think it's specifically because of the connection I made after the professor brought that up. So the second language I know is American Sign Language, and I'm not fully fluent in it. I think it is the second language that I use the most, only because I am currently taking American Sign Language classes, and that is the minor that I am pursuing, and I think American Sign Language will be a big part of my future career as an audiologist. So yeah, as of right now, I'm not fully fluent. I'm hoping to get there, or at least get a little bit more fluent so that communication is easier with fluent and native sign language users. But I did have a small introduction to American Sign Language when I was younger. I had a friend whose parents were both deaf when I was in about preschool or kindergarten, and because of that, I learned basic sign language. We would do the alphabet, numbers. They had a name sign for me, and they would just teach me like basic signs. And I remember one of the signs that they taught me was like "me too," like I agree with you, like same. And I used to like use that all the time, and for some reason that's the sign that sticks out to the most to me of what I learned very young. And dog, I learned that because of them too. But my learning of sign language kind of stopped from a young age until I was in college. I was not actively pursuing learning it, and I didn't have any expectation to continue learning it after I was that young. But then I came to college, and because of my major, I took an American Sign Language Level 1 class, and basically instantly decided that was going to be my minor, and that this was a language that I wanted to know and know well and be able to communicate effectively with. And at first that was all it was to me, was just a language that I wanted to learn. But I think the meaning of it has changed a lot, especially in these later levels of sign language that I've been taking, and through taking these culture classes, it has really adapted how I feel and the meaning that American Sign Language has to me, because such a strong culture does encompass American Sign Language, and there's such a tight-knit community, and there's so many things that I've learned about in the later classes that I think have attributed a lot to the passion I have for continuing to learn sign language and the way that I view it now and what it means to me now. I think the reason that American Sign Language was a language that has been so easy for me to kind of connect to and be passionate about is because there's a lot of connection between English and American Sign Language. Like, obviously, they're two completely separate languages, but a lot of the culture behind them is very similar. So, deaf culture obviously has its own culture and own values and own beliefs, but a lot of American culture is mixed with that, and there can be other cultures that get mixed with deaf culture, but specifically American deaf culture is something that I can relate to and something that I can connect to a lot better than maybe languages that have other cultural backgrounds. And we've talked about this throughout our reading between the signs and our workbooks and our intercultural communication readings, and how both English and American Sign Language are direct languages, although American Sign Language is more direct. And we had a workbook assignment this week that talked about like rudeness being relative, and I noticed that a lot of what we think as the hearing culture, like what we think is rude, the deaf culture also views as being rude, but maybe on a different scale. Like, we might view something as being more rude or less rude because of our language use specifically, and vice versa. So that is what I think has made it a lot easier for me to transition and kind of accept and want to learn more about this language as a whole, is because our cultures do interlap. So, yeah. And then there's a third language that I was learning. I'm not learning it anymore, but that is Spanish. And I began learning Spanish when I was about in preschool or kindergarten. So this was the only school that I went to that was not primarily English speaking. It was pretty 50-50 Spanish and English speaking students. The teachers would teach lessons in both Spanish and English. And I remember that those experiences I had when I was in that school, I was, in some cases, very much a minority. Like, there's pictures of me in my classes where I was the only little girl with blonde hair and blue eyes that was primarily an English speaker. And during this time in my life, I was very fluent in Spanish. And my mom taught at that school, and she's still fluent in Spanish, but I was very fluent in Spanish for a 5-year-old. Like, I could have conversations at the level that a native Spanish speaker could have at 5 years old, because that was what I was learning in, and I was learning in English and in Spanish. But I moved from that school, and I went to a different school where I was primarily in English speaking. We didn't have lessons taught in both languages, and I lost a lot of my Spanish skills, and I didn't use Spanish nearly as much, or rarely ever. But I got to high school, I took a Spanish level intro, like Spanish 1 intro level class, and it was super easy because I think that's because I had the background I had when I was little, and I ended up going all the way to Spanish level 5 in high school, and then I took a Spanish class in college as well, and then I just kind of stopped, and I didn't grow my knowledge of Spanish anymore after my freshman year of college, and I don't really use it anymore, and I feel like I've lost a lot of it, and that makes me sad because it is such a strong skill to have, especially in Colorado and in the United States, with Spanish being the second most used language in America. That might be wrong. I think it's right. I think it's English and then Spanish, but it's a nice skill to have. And like living in Greeley, I have am working where I work at a coffee shop. I interact with people on a daily basis who speak Spanish. So I wish that I had that skill a little bit more and I would have held on to it more. Um, but I think the reason that I didn't continue with it and pursue it and try to become more fluent was because my passion for it wasn't there. I hadn't really learned a lot about the culture that encompasses Spanish, and there's so many different cultures and so many different countries that use Spanish and variations of Spanish, and um, it's kind of sad to say, but I couldn't connect as much to that culture and couldn't understand it as much, whereas with American Deaf culture, there is a lot of things that interact with one another, and yeah, so that's kind of the languages that I have had experiences with, the levels I know them on. I would say English primarily my number one, definitely fluent in. American Sign Language my number two. I am definitely more fluent in that than I am in Spanish, but not even close to as fluent as I am in English. And then Spanish is my number three. I can have probably a 5 or 6 year old level conversation in Spanish. But yeah, I've lost a lot of those skills. So, thank you.